I won't go through the summary of Zephaniah because I don't think it's actually that useful to do the summary before we've gone through the details. But just before we go into Nahum itself, I want to point out that observation that intriguingly that Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah sequence, which you find in all collections of the 12, they do come in that order, even though that doesn't seem to be chronological. Zephaniah being a bit earlier. It does reflect the Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel order, because Nahum has this close link with Isaiah 52. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation. And Habakkuk has a close link, I think, with Jeremiah 5. That's not as often observed, but we'll come to that when we get there. I think it's quoting Jeremiah 5. And Zephaniah has something that Ezekiel quotes. In Ezekiel 22, its princes within it are like a roaring lion tearing the prey. They have devoured human lives. They have taken treasure and precious things. They've made many widows within it. Its priests have done violence to my teaching and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common, and so on. Its officials within it are like wolves tearing the prey. Its prophets have smeared whitewash. It's all quite a bit longer than what we have in Zephaniah, but Zephaniah gives us the princes, the officials, the prophets, has the image of the wolves, and so on. So Ezekiel picks up the condemnation from Zephaniah and expands on it. And I'm not sure there's any great significance to it, but it's just interesting that Nahum has this link with Isaiah, Habakkuk this link with Jeremiah, close link, and Ezekiel and Zephaniah are linked. But let's go to Nahum. Might as well use my translation. A pronouncement concerning Nineveh, the document of a revelation to Nahum the Elkoshite. The very first word has caused a bit of debate. Masa, I've translated it as pronouncement in a quite general way. ESV has oracle, but the King James Version had burden, and the NIV has prophecy. That is because the word masa relates to the root, the verb for lifting up, and from that comes the word for burden. So masa clearly means burden in some cases, like if you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, it's clearly not lying down under its prophecy, its oracle. So there it clearly means burden, and a number of other occasions. And in the days of the King James Version, it was kind of thought that this is a genre designation, a particular type of oracle that is burdensome. And that's why the King James Version would translate it consistently as burden. You've got particularly many of those in Isaiah. An oracle concerning Moab. Note King James Version down here, the burden of Moab. Then the oracle concerning Damascus. The oracle concerning Egypt. The oracle concerning the desert of the sea, a symbolic designation. Duma, which is in Edom. So in Isaiah, it's used in particular for foreign nations. But Jeremiah uses it by way of a wordplay. Is that in, I think it's in 23 actually. When one of his people, or a prophet or a priest, asks you, what is the burden? And probably we should translate here, what is the oracle? What is the pronouncement of the Lord? And it's playing then on the two meanings of the word, because the answer then is, you are the burden. ESV translates burden in both cases so that you can see the link. But what is obscured thereby is that it's playing on the two different meanings of the word. So it doesn't actually mean burden at first. And so he uses it a few times. And then let me go to Zechariah. I've mentioned that Zechariah 1 to 8 is organized quite differently from 9 to 14. And one difference is that Zechariah 1 to 8 has these headings with very specific dates, like Haggai. It's very similarly done like is the book of Haggai. But in Zechariah 9 begins with Massa, the oracle, the burden, the pronouncement of the word of the Lord against the land of Hadrach and Damascus. And then that heading is picked up concerning Israel. So we know from this, well, it can't be only against foreign nations, because it's used here for Israel. And that is actually also found in Malachi. That's how Malachi begins, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. So people have wondered, what is Massa? And there's one who did his PhD on it and argues that there's a very specific meaning of oracle here. He argues that a Massa is an oracle that explains a puzzling action of God or explains a previous oracle. It does actually fit quite well with Habakkuk, also with Nahum, but because we see in Habakkuk it comes up as well, Hamasa, the oracle that Habakkuk saw. But it doesn't fit quite so well in some other places. So I'm more persuaded by the view that Massa refers to an indirect oracle, some sort of indirect communication. But there remains a bit of uncertainty. Indirect communication would fit here, and that's why most of those pronouncements are against foreign nations, because we don't actually expect Nahum to go to Nineveh. It's a pronouncement about Nineveh that's heard in Judah rather than in Nineveh. So it's an indirect prophecy. And then further specified with a second heading, the document of a revelation to Nahum the Elkoshite, or a book of the vision. We mustn't overdraw the kind of distinction between oral and the written, but it is interesting that you're pointed to something written here. As I've mentioned yesterday, was it? Oh, I'm losing track now. This is the only book in the Minor Prophets that actually you get some writing in connection with the whole prophecy, that an acknowledgement that this is a book in writing. Why would that be here? Possibly because Nahum never preached orally. Maybe this was from the start in writing, and that's why we have Sefer here. It was kind of a flyer that's being distributed. Or maybe that in this version, we are to pay particular attention to literary features that don't come out so well in oral proclamation. And I'll give you the example for that in a moment. A book of the revelation or vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Briefly something about Nahum the Elkoshite. What does it mean to call someone the Elkoshite? Can you think of parallels in the Old Testament of someone being called the so-and-so? Yeah, Uriah the Hittite. So that would be where he came from. Sorry? Yes, the Shuhite, yes. And Elijah. And so on. So most of the time they are referring to a location, but I think there's an obvious right as well that refers to a family clan. So it's not. So in other words, it's not entirely clear whether Elkosh is meant to refer to a location or to a clan. In either case, we don't know any Elkosh or any city called Elkoshi, so we can't use that to pinpoint Nahum more precisely. And there is just a question mark whether this is actually the real name or whether that's the pen name of the prophet. Because Nahum means, it's a form of comfort, being comforted, a passive form. And Ha-el-Kushi sounds very much like the God of strength. And so you could argue that's kind of summarizing the message perfectly. What Nahum is going to offer us is comfort from a severe, actually it's more literal kasha, from comfort from a severe God. It's juxtaposition of severe, and yet you get comfort from this severe God. That's why I put on the handout this quotation from Peter Leithart. This is in relation to Nahum, of course, in relation to Isaiah, but I think it applies here as well. The servant of the Lord is anointed to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, and to comfort the mourners. Now, these are often seen as separate, and people make a lot of Jesus quoting the first half. He brings the acceptable year of the Lord, and then the day of vengeance is for another time. But Peter Leithart points out these are not opposites. They proclaim the same fact from different angles. And the connection is underscored by a Hebrew play on the words nakam and naham, sounding very similar, vengeance and comfort. And we find those same words here. Naham, comfort in the passive form. Comforted, Nahum is the name, Nahum. And vengeance is, in the very next verse, a God of vengeance. Avenging is, a zealous and avenging God is the verb form used here. So in Isaiah, Peter Leithart points out, comfort is not therapeutic. It's not soothing that enables someone to tolerate intolerable conditions. Comfort is a change of condition. So someone is suffering, how do you provide comfort for them? One way is to soothe them, and it's not as bad, and look at the bright side or whatever. Another way to comfort them is to change the situation, to make it better for them. And Peter says this is actually what's happening in Isaiah. The mourners are comforted because their whole situation is changed, and they can wear festal garments. It's a change of condition that happens when God acts to defend them, to overthrow their enemies, to deliver them from slavery. In other words, vengeance is comforting. When God executes vengeance on his enemies, there's comfort for his people. And we find that very same thing in in Nahum. A book that is meant to offer comfort by talking about God primarily in terms of vengeance. And the name, whether by some providence or because some indirect providence, the parents without knowing what they were doing were giving him this name, or whether by inspiration the prophet chose this pen name to sum up his message, we don't know, but it certainly fits nicely. Why would God give us such a book? I put a few headings down there on page 28 that come from a kind of Lenten talk I gave once in Barnet, where I live, for different churches coming together. And I recalled a friend where I studied who had, in his library, he put little red dots on some books. And they were, I think, meant as a signal to his wife. These books are potentially harmful, dodgy theology. It's not quite sound. I read them as a theologian anyway, because there's some good things in there, or because maybe there's some things I need to learn more about to refute it better. But you better don't look at it. So he red dotted some books. If he were to do that with the Bible, then Nahum would be in a category for many people, say, let's red dot that. There's so much bloody violence in there that's not suitable. In our British context, and anyway, Nahum might be awarded a 15 certificate. I don't know what you do in Ethiopia, whether you've got, when you go to the cinema, whether films have a certificate not suitable for children or whatever. Nahum could be a certificate 15 with the warning, because if you go to Netflix, it usually gives you a little headline of what might come up. Yeah, contains frequent, strong violence, including brief scenes of sexual violence. You might not want to watch that with your primary school children. It's certainly a very challenging book. I had one colleague once who said the whole Bible is for children as well. And he said every part of the Bible can be preached to children as well. I'm not quite convinced about it, but he was very good. He was excellent. And he was able to, maybe he would have been, I never heard of Nahum, and sadly he died in a car accident. He would have maybe been able to preach at an old age talk to young children from Nahum. I don't know. I would think really twice or three times about doing that. Why would God give us such a violent book? Because I gave this talk a few years back when 12 Years a Slave came out. Do you know that film? Well, it's based on a book, biographical, so it's based on a memoir, really. As I've written here down, because I wouldn't have remembered otherwise. David Wilson, New York state-born free African-American man. So up in the north, where there's no slavery, but he gets kidnapped by two conmen and then sold into slavery. And he tells his story, and it's a remarkable story and a remarkable film. And it's a story that cannot be told without violence and probably even without some nudity. So this is not violence, portraying violence because it excites some people. They like to see that violence. It's not showing nudity because it arouses people. But because to tell this story accurately and well and faithfully, you cannot avoid those things. And I think that's going on in Nahum. For the things that by God's inspiration, Nahum is asked to talk about, he couldn't talk about those things without talking about violence, even sexual violence, in some detail. And it's an important story to be told because just like 12 Years a Slave, it's not just about one person or place. It's a story that can become paradigmatic for others as well. And that's why it's, of course, in the canon and worth our while to look at it. Getting my computer back because I need to look at the Hebrew for this part. I mentioned one odd thing is that, well, two odd things. One is that Nahum has two headings. Why two headings? Some people think that they relate to different parts of the book, or what? I don't think that likely. But the other odd thing is, if you do have to have two headings, why in this order? It would seem to make more sense to say, here's a book about Nahum's vision, the revelation given to Nahum, and then secondly, this is what it's about. It's an entire communication, a pronouncement about Nineveh. Why put it this way around? Well, we don't have a certain answer to that, but one Dutch scholar observed that in this order, if you treat those two headings as if they were poetry, they're not really poetry, but the rest of the book, or the rest of the next few lines are all in poetry. Two lines, always bicolon. We use the term bicolon. So two two lines belonging together, making one unit. If you do that here, then the first four of these units, two-part units, if you look at a letter with which they end, it spells the divine name. And of course, it wouldn't do that if you had the first in the other order. Then you would ruin that. Yeah, that could be a coincidence because the letter hey, they're reasonably common letters. But yeah, it's quite an interesting coincidence. You have exactly the 4 letters of the divine name in the first 4 lines of the book. Particularly if you think that also then, if you look at the beginning of the actual poem, verse 2, and you look at the first letter of the first 3 lines of the poems, the first 3 sort of double lines, they spell I. And together, that would spell I am the Lord. Because in Hebrew, you don't use a verb in between. It just says I, the Lord. So that is quite a remarkable coincidence that the beginning of the book would in this way spell I am the Lord and would make us think about the divine name, the significance of the divine name. And I'm inclined to think it's not a coincidence. It's something that only works really on the written page. This is not something you can hear so well. And that's maybe why we get a signal here, Sefer. Think of this as a written thing and look out for written features that you wouldn't be able to hear. But if you see it on the page or on the computer screen, you can see I am the Lord as the opening message. Because then verse 2 has a zealous and avenging God is the Lord. Avenging is the Lord and a master of rage. Avenging is the Lord towards his enemies. One who remains agitated against his enemies. So that sums up what this will be about before we then come to the quotation of Exodus 34. So having verse 2, before we go to the allusion to Exodus 34 in verse 3, means we keep the avenging and the comfort close together. Nahum comfort through the avenging. And these are all participle forms. I am avenging, zealous and avenging God. Avenging is the Lord. One who remains agitated is how I translate therefore. Because one of the things that Nahum is telling us, that God is continuously zealous and avenging. He remains agitated against his enemies. And I think I've already given you a preview of that. One of the messages in Nahum is that God doesn't flare up in anger. He's always angry. Because wherever there's evil, he remains agitated against his enemies. While that may sound rather negative, someone who's always angry, I don't want to deal with that. But of course, the beautiful thing is that the Lord God doesn't act on his anger most of the time. He's slow to anger. The anger is there because there's a consistent hostility towards evil, but we don't see that side nearly as often as we might, because God is also slow to anger. And sometimes it's quite frustrating when God is slow to anger, because I'm sure the people in Jerusalem were quite happy to think of God as being angry with Nineveh. They would have wanted him to do something about that anger sooner rather than later. But Nahum is telling now the time is coming when God will act on his anger. And then in verse 3, he begins to tie this together with the revelation of God's name in Exodus 34. So this is exactly at the point when the acrostic and telestic, to use a technical term, so the looking at the first letters and the last letters, having spelled I am the Lord, just where that comes to an end, we have the allusion to the explanation of the Lord's name in Exodus 34. And, we are back in Nahum. I'm wanting to check how the ESV translates this. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. Which is the standard translation. But I wanted to be a bit more precise in my translation, because that's not exactly what's going on in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, the divine name is fronted. It's put right at the beginning of the sentence. So it's normally, if you wanted to say the Lord is slow to anger, in Hebrew, you would phrase it, you would use the predicate element first. Slow to anger is the Lord. But here the order is reversed. The Lord comes first, is fronted. And that's why I translate the Lord, he is slow to anger. So there's a focus on the divine name, because it comes first in the line. The same is true in the next line. The Lord, in gale and storm is his way. Again, the divine name is fronted in a slightly surprising syntactical construction. It's quite difficult, although I think it works just about here in English. It's difficult to imitate that in English, because English is not very flexible when it comes to word order, not like German or Hebrew. Hebrew is a lot more flexible, so you can do things, manipulate a word order to bring out a particular message. And what Nahum is doing here is, for 2 lines, he fronts the divine name. So 2 poetic lines begin with the divine name. Just after having spelled out, I am the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. This is what it means to be the Lord. What that means is that the other thing that I've already alluded to that Nahum wants to do is to create a poem that imitates an alphabetic acrostic. So one of those poems where the first line begins with the first letter of the alphabet, or the first double line. The second double line begins with the second letter, the third with the third letter, and so on. Now that's a bit difficult to do when you start with the divine name twice. The first letter of the alphabet actually comes in the second word with the slow to anger. But it is easier to spot by the fact that it comes twice. So the second and the third word begin with the first letter of the alphabet. The Lord is slow to anger, but abounding in power. And he will certainly not absolve. The abounding in power is, of course, an interesting change from Exodus 34, because there's abounding in steadfast love, chesed, which Nahum replaces in power, because now comes the time for action that he wants to focus in. The next line, again, the Lord is fronted, then in gale and in storm, begins with the second letter of the alphabet. This is quite difficult to follow, I'm sure, not having the Hebrew. But then we have the second letter of the alphabet, and in gale, and literally in gale, and in storm, and it's the word in that is expressed in the Hebrew with the second letter of the alphabet. So we've got it twice again, which I think should help to signal the slightly obscured beginning of the poem, that it is the first letter, then the second letter, and then in verse 4, the third letter. Now we don't have the divine name, so the third letter literally begins the line. He blasts the sea and dries it up, and all the streams he makes dry. Then we have something interesting happening in the next line. Withered are Bashan and Carmel, the bud of Lebanon is withered. And I've translated it this way so you could see that it's the same word at the beginning and the end of the line, which is unusual. In Hebrew poetry, you would, with pairing lines, you would usually vary the words used. And in fact, when you look at the Greek, they use 2 different words here. And And the Greek translation of Nahum is quite close to the Hebrew text. So that might suggest that they had two different ones. But it's quite a challenging one. It's a very technical discussion as to what the Greek author might have seen. One speculation is often that the word that begins umlal, that the manuscript was maybe dirty or something, and you could just see the two lamets, the two L's of that, but it was with a different letter, the fourth letter of the alphabet, it started. So that would continue the alphabetic sequence. We had the first letter, the second letter, the third letter, now the fourth letter. Others think, well, there's too much strange things happening. There's no alphabetic acrostic at all. But I think, actually, you could argue that the fourth letter is deliberately missing. And that it's missing is signaled by using the same verb twice, which is unusual. So it causes you to pause and think, oh, what's going on here? Why does he use umlaut twice? And you think, well, he could have used, and if you think of what could he have used instead, you think of a word that actually begins with the fourth letter. So that word that begins with the fourth letter is there in the reader's working through, but it's not there in the text. The reader knows the author could have used this word. Why didn't they? Well, because withered are Bashan and Carmel, the bud of Lebanon is withered, and one way to symbolize the withering is to get rid of the Dalet. The Dalet, the fourth letter of the alphabet, is withered away. Then the fifth letter of the alphabet is there again. You do need some letters to preserve the alphabetic acrostic, even if you're messing with it. The mountains shake because of him. The hills go to pieces. And the earth rears before him. And that's unusual to start a poetic line with and. I didn't even translate it here. Maybe should have. But it makes sense here because that is the sixth letter of the alphabet. So by adding the end, you continue the alphabetic acrostic. And so that signals to me, yes, there is something going on here that is deliberate. The earth rears before him, the world and all who inhabit it. Before his scorn, who can stand? Again, it seems that Nahum pictures what he's saying in the poetry, because we're now expecting, if we are following the alphabet, the seventh letter of the alphabet. And it's not there at the beginning of the line. The word before comes before. But the seventh letter is actually there in the very next word, before his wrath. And there are many words one could use for God's anger, rage, wrath, and so on. But the word used here is the one that begins with the seventh letter of the alphabet. So the poet preserves the seventh letter, but displaces it, pushes it inside the line by having something before the Lord who can stand, which is a very unusual word order anyway, emphasizing this before the Lord, because if you had, I'm sure most translations simply translate who will stand before the Lord. Let's go there. Who can stand before his indignation? Or ESV, who can stand before his indignation? In Hebrew, that would look different if it was literally this. So the Hebrew doesn't literally say who can stand before his indignation, but before his indignation, who can stand? And in English, you can hardly do that. In Hebrew, you can do it more easily. But even in Hebrew, that is unusual. And so this is one of the things you lose in translation, because all translations, I think, decide that to translate as I've done, before his scorn, who can stand, it's just too odd in English. And therefore, they go for the standard English word order. but they miss the point that the poet is even painting a picture of before, something happening before the Lord. Who can stand? Who can rise in the heat of his anger? And so it means that in that poetry, the standing and the rising, the two verbs, are in the middle of the line, are bringing those two activities together. And at the outside is before the Lord, before scorn, and in the heat of his anger, corresponding to each other. Then we have the 8th letter of the alphabet, another word for wrath. His rage is poured out like fire. The rocks are torn asunder because of him. And then again, it continues with the next letter of the alphabet. This way you see that I think this can't really be a coincidence. Yes, there's a lot of exceptions and there's a lot going on, but actually it does follow the alphabet here. So it's Tov now. Good is the Lord. Good is the Lord as a stronghold in a day of distress. I've translated it like this because the as a stronghold is put poetically in the middle, so it could go with either line. Good is the Lord as a stronghold, or good is the Lord as a stronghold in a day of distress. The poet arranges it such that a stronghold is arising in the middle of the line here. And he knows those who seek refuge in him. And with a sweeping flood, a full end he makes of her place. His enemies he pursues in the darkness. Again, the next letter of the alphabet that we would expect is the word that is the most prominent word in the line, but isn't actually at the beginning of the line. It's the end word, the making an end. And we've seen that it's a very prominent word for the day of the Lord. And so we're wondering, has the alphabet come to an end as well here? And in a sense it has, but the poet seems to be teasing with us, because the very next line begins with mem, which still follows the alphabet somewhere. But it then does fizzle out, the alphabet here. So we only get half the alphabet, and we do get it messed up. The poet is playing a lot with it. What are we to make of this? Basically, 3 options. One is to go back and say, well, this is just too messy. It's all coincidence. Nothing to see here. Nothing's happening there. And as I said, I think that's asking a lot. There will be a lot of coincidence happening. The other option is, at one time, this was a proper alphabetic poem, and someone messed it up in transmission by accident. Or, as I argue, but I don't think many people believe me, but some people do, but not all have bought it. I argue this is someone who deliberately manipulates the idea of an alphabetic acrostic. And if the observation by the Dutch scholar is correct that we've got I am the Lord here with the beginning and the end lines, then we are talking about the author who is really quite clever and does something poetically that's more sophisticated than your ordinary acrostic poem. In that case, if it is deliberate, what's the reason behind that? There are smaller reasons why the disruptions happen at the place where they do happen, at the beginning, because the poet wants to focus on the divine name, so he puts the divine name first, and thereby obscures the beginning with the first 2 letters. But in order to help us see those first 2 letters, he repeats those 2 letters so we can see them more clearly. then there's this before his scorn, the word before, kind of ironically fits well as the word that comes before the letter that we're expecting, and so on. But what's the overarching purpose? And we talked about the withering away of the Daleth. So it's playing around with a few minor things, but what's the overarching purpose? Well, that depends on what the purpose of an acrostic is. And an alphabetic acrostic is usually, can have two functions. One is a way of speaking about a totality of something. Let me talk to you about something from A to Z, we might say in the Latin English alphabet. From alpha to omega, we might say in Greek. So to express totality, I write a poem that goes through all the letters of the alphabet. And that's presumably going on, for example, in Psalm 119, where you get 8 lines for each letter of the alphabet. A sign of totality and perfection, which then goes to the other important thing, that it's a sign of order, by the poet deliberately limiting himself to, I need to find something that goes with this letter. It creates an order. And I think that's quite often that's what's going on in the Psalms and what's going on in Lamentations. Because Lamentations consists of poems that all use the alphabetic acrostic except for the last one, which, however, consists of 22 lines, the same number of lines, so still echoing the acrostic. And Lamentations is a time of particular distress and expressing that distress over the destruction of Jerusalem. And doing so in the form of an acrostic is an attempt to bring some order to the chaos that is in the city and in your heart. In a similar but different way, Nahum, I think, wants to allude to the order of all things, that God is in charge. And when we talk about God, it's a poem about God, of course. He creates order, but the order is disrupted, and it's not visible as readily. So God is a sovereign God who orders the world well, but if you've got the Assyrians oppressing you, you can't actually see that order. And there's something gone wrong, something broken, so I call it a broken acrostic. And I think that Nahum wants to indicate here something about what he's going to talk about, that the order, God's good order, is disrupted here in what's happening with the oppression at the hand of the Assyrians. Which would be an argument for saying that this poem really goes very closely together with what follows, which is something that is contested by other scholars, because there are a number of scholars who argue that the book of Nahum has this one theological poem, and then it has all these war poems, and they don't really belong together. And the war poems were something that Nahum did, and then someone else thought, we'll better put some theology into this, and added something else. But I think the way the poetry works here, it's already conveying that message of the disrupted order that is then spoken of in different ways later on. So it's very closely, much more closely integrated with it. Where does the poem end? It's not entirely clear, just as it's not entirely clear where the acrostic end. Because in some ways, verse 7 is the climax. Good is the Lord as a stronghold. That's the key message in the day of distress. And then verse 8 does sound like an ending. And with a sweeping flood, a full end he makes of her place. Notice the reference to her place, which, whose place? Nothing's been mentioned in the poem. Her place only makes sense if you include the superscription, an oracle about Nineveh. Then you know, Nineveh's place. So you need that, which is an argument in favor of that observation that you're meant to read the superscription together with the poem. Only if you read them together do they spell, I am the Lord. And only if you read them together do you know whose place it is here. of which the Lord makes a full end. His enemies he pursues into darkness. So that sounds like an end. But verse 9 and 10 still closely belong to that, because they draw a consequence from that. What do you ponder concerning the Lord? What do you think about the Lord? I think some translate as conspire against the Lord. And sometimes the thinking that people do is a conspiring. But the word used here, devise against, plot against, ESV, plot against. That's quite a narrow rendering of the Hebrew. That's broader. Uses the word for thinking. Same word as for the ship, thinking about breaking up. And it uses the preposition to, as in Jonah 3, speak to Nineveh rather than against Nineveh. So, as I said, these prepositions can take each other's meanings. It's not as clear-cut, but it's not quite as clear it's a plotting against the Lord. If it's a plotting against the Lord, then it's presumably addressed to Nineveh. What do you plot against the Lord? You won't have success. But you could translate it as, what do you ponder concerning the Lord? And then it becomes a question that's addressed to anyone reading this, and more like the Judeans. So what is it that you think about the Lord? We've just spelled out what it means, what God means by being God, by being Yahweh, being gracious and merciful, by no slow to anger, and that's why he hasn't intervened against Nineveh before. But he does now act against them because he is full of power. And so you have this destructive moment. This is what God is doing. Question, is this what you think about the Lord? Are you, in other words, using the words of Hosea, are you wise and discerning in agreeing with this description of God and his character? What is it that deep down you think God is doing? Or do you think God doesn't care for us, he's never done anything? No, he will make a full end. Distress will not arise a second time. So you see that there are three lines belonging together now, a tricolon. And sometimes that alternation between using 2 lines and 3 lines signals a transition or conclusion of a poem, as it seems to here. So we've got 2 lines with 3 half or 3/3. For they are, this is a very difficult verse to translate, for they are akin to thorns entangled, and like their drink drunk, they are consumed like fully dry stubble. And we don't have enough ancient Hebrew text to know whether that pun that works in English would have worked exactly in Hebrew like that. The drunk. They are drunk because they're intoxicated. They're drinking from their drink. And so they're running into thorns. They don't know what they're doing. But then they're also drunk in a second sense, maybe, like you drink a glass and you make it empty. You make a full end of it. They're drunk like that. They're consumed like fully dry stubble. So maybe that the poet is working on those 2 different meanings of the word drunk, and that it could work in Hebrew as well. They are drunk as intoxicated, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they are drunk in being made a full end. They're drunk up. So we see in this opening poem that God is good because he's a stronghold against evil. That's what it means for God, to be good, or one important aspect of what it means for God to be good, is that he provides protection from evil. That requires that he is really opposed to evil, implacably opposed to evil. He tolerates evil, but not forever. So this is in the old meaning of the word tolerating or tolerance. It's a great shame that certainly in the contemporary West, the word tolerance has taken on a very different meaning. That we are told to tolerate people, and what it means is that we're meant to be okay with whatever people are doing. You should tolerate this. It's okay. It's fine. But tolerating is something in the original sense that you do with something that you don't like. If you like it, there's no need to tolerate it. I don't tolerate good food. I like it. I don't tolerate someone being nice to me. I like it. So I tolerate when things are bad. Sometimes I tolerate it. When people are bad to me, I tolerate it. That means I live with it. I agree with it, but I don't act against it. So that's what it means for God to be tolerant. Not that he agrees with evil, ever. He's implacably opposed to evil, whatever is wrong. But because he's slow to anger, for a lot of time, he's a very tolerant God in the literal meaning, original meaning of the word tolerance. He puts up with evil. He puts up with a lot of evil, but not forever. Because he is all-powerful, and he is prepared to use his power against evil. And why? Because he knows those who seek refuge in him. If he would never use his power against evil, then he wouldn't be much of a protection for those who seek refuge in him. If he would never act against evil, it wouldn't be very clear that evil is different from good. If God were constantly tolerating good and evil, you do what you like, I don't mind, I don't act either way, then he would not be a good God. He's a good God because he loves good and he hates evil. And that's why at some point, while God is ready to forgive, he does not do so by just sweeping evil under the carpet. And that's why we need a cross. God is able to forgive without punishment. We see that a number of times in the Bible, that God forgives without any payment, without any punishment. So it would be, I think, wrong to say, as some people say in penal substitutionary atonement, God must punish, therefore you must punish someone in order to forgive. No, God is able to forgive without punishing here and there, but not forever. If he never acts against evil, if he never punishes evil, if he always forgives, then he treats evil just like good. And so in that sense, he does have to punish. Not in order to be able to forgive in each instance, he always has to punish someone, but in order ultimately to offer forgiveness, true forgiveness, which acknowledges that evil is evil and not on the same level and the same significance and the same as good. Evil is bad and needs to be therefore punished to show the difference between good and evil. Because forgiveness without punishment has the risk of just treating good and evil the same. In fact, that's why forgiveness and punishment aren't always alternatives. You can forgive and punish at the same time. Because forgiveness is about the restoration of relationship, and punishment is about executing justice. And one good modern example is Rachel Den Hollander. You know Rachel Den Hollander, the athletics woman, American gymnast, who was the first one to speak out against the abuse that those gymnasts suffered from their trainer. And she led the campaign in the end, and she is a committed Christian. And in the law court, she was given an opportunity to speak at some length about why she's bringing that cause. And she spoke there very eloquently, I'm sure it's somewhere on YouTube, about her readiness to forgive this person for the evil he has done to her, but insisting that this needs to be punished in this society because this abuse is widespread. And in order for us as a society to take such abuse seriously, people need to be imprisoned for it. They will need to know, to experience in their lives that this is evil, what they did. And others need to be able to see this is evil. And so, as she demonstrates, and you find in some other instances, it is possible to forgive someone, to say, you need to be punished for this, you need to pay for this, you need to make good for this, but this evil you have done, I will not allow that to get in the way of our relationship. And forgiveness is about, I'm prepared to be in a good, positive relationship with you. So if someone does commit sexual abuse and is imprisoned and he gets out of prison, we will forgive them if they are repentant. They will receive that forgiveness. But we will never put them in charge of the children's work. That will be a long-term consequence. And it doesn't take away from the forgiveness, but that's just what it is. And if someone has been cheating you on the finances, one of the neighboring churches had lots of money stolen by their treasurer, found a way of siphoning off money. If you discover that can be forgiven, and there can be punishment and justice, because the society and the state will expect that as much as possible that person will undo the damage they've done, although it's only ever possible in a small way, that they can repay the debt. And then you can say, we're forgiven, we're clear on this, but you won't make that person treasurer again. So forgiveness and negative consequences are not in opposition to each other. You can forgive someone, be reconciled with them, the relationship is good again, but you can still keep negative consequences in place as a means of taking the evil seriously and the risk seriously of that evil. So on the cross, evil is taken very seriously and sort of crossed out in the sense of being condemned for what it is. On the cross, evil is nailed, shown for what it is at its root. I'm using an English idiom, nailing down something. But okay, this is what it means. On the cross, evil is nailed, shown what it is truly. Evil is opposition to God. That's what it is deep down at its heart. Jesus died for all our sins. They find expression in all sorts of different ways, but ultimately they all go back to opposition to God. And that's why the way he died had to be as a consequence of opposition to God. If Jesus had died in good old ripe age on his deathbed, that wouldn't be a suitable atoning sacrifice for sins. Even though it would be quite something even then for the living God to become a human being and to die. But his death, for it to have this atoning significance, the condemnation of evil had to come as a result of evil embodied in the opposition of God, in the opposition against God, to God. And that's why this does involve an act of injustice. And that's why many people struggle with penal substitutionary atonement and say, this is completely unjust. And there are ways of phrasing penal substitutionary atonement that make it sound all wrong, and that are, in fact, sound quite wrong. when you pit the Father against the Son, because it's not the Father's punishing the Son. The New Testament actually never uses that language, the Father punishing the Son. Always using the language of the Son taking our punishment upon himself, which is slightly different. And the Son is not an innocent bystander. The Son, of course, completely agrees with the Father. It's not the Father imposing something on the Son. The Son takes the punishment voluntarily upon himself. That is of key significance. And if you lose that, you distort the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. The voluntariness and not just the willingness, but the volunteering for it that comes from the Son is an integral, important part of what is happening there. But where people complain about it, the one right thing is there is injustice involved in this. And that's part of the point. Because it is dealing with evil, and evil is injustice. So it incorporates that evil. It can only condemn evil by showing up evil. And therefore, what happened on the cross was an act of God's righteousness, but also an act of great injustice at the same time. We are involved in the battle against evil is the next heading I've given to that. God has won the decisive victory against evil. We read that in Colossians 2. He has disarmed the authorities and so on. So we know the battle is the Lord's. He has won the victory on the cross. And as in the Old, so in the New Testament, God is the avenger. So that one of the beautiful things about the Psalms of Vengeance is that the vengeance that comes up in us will take, and then we give it to God rather than act on it ourselves. God is the one who's the avenger in Romans 12. Even when he uses others, because God likes to work in indirect means and using legitimate authorities. Romans 13, using the Babylonians, using the Assyrians. So what's our involvement in that? If God is the one who avenges and uses legitimate authorities to do that, how are we involved in the battle against evil? Well, of course, first we need to recognize that the closest battle zone for us is our own heart. And our involvement needs to be zero tolerance with evil in our own hearts. And that comes from getting a clearer picture of what evil looks like to God. And that's where the prophets can help us a lot, to show us how abhorrent evil is in God's sight. And that should help us to exercise zero tolerance with evil in our own hearts. And that's where Nahum's poetry can be a weapon in that fight for our own heart and then for other hearts and minds. I put Revelation as an interesting parallel because you've got the dragon and the sea monster, the imperial power and the other monsters. There's quite a lot going on in Revelation there. Because evil comes in different forms, the dragon speaks of the supernatural evil, Satan and his forces that is behind the Roman imperial power. The sea monster addresses specifically the Roman political, military power, and that's overcome through martyrdom, not by kicking back, fighting back, but by accepting martyrdom. And then there's the other monster there, which seems to stand for Rome's propaganda machine. Paul reminds us that our fight is not against flesh and blood. Our fight is against the authorities. Our battle is fought in the hearts and minds of people and in the supernatural realm. And so our role must be in intercession to engage the supernatural realm, and in dealing with the propaganda war, overcoming the error by truth-telling. And that's where Nahum in particular can help us. He provides us a weapon to fight for the truth against the propaganda machine of the Assyrian Empire. Because the Assyrians presented themselves as inconquerable, and the Judeans were tempted to believe that. And Nahum's poetry helps them to see, no, actually, like fully dried stubble, you put a match to it, and it burns up. Just in one moment, quickly can be destroyed. Such truth-telling is never just a matter of establishing the truth and telling the facts, but also engaging the emotions. And that's where we come to those key images. But before we get to them, let's read on a bit more on Nahum. So we've had the first poem and a challenge. What are you thinking about God? And therefore, what are you thinking about the Assyrians? If you are afraid of Nineveh and the Assyrians as a mighty power that no one can stand against, that means you've got a wrong view about God. And that's why Nahum addresses it, first of all, by talking about God. Remember who God is, Exodus 34, 6 and 7. I am the Lord, he reveals himself. Remember what it means to be God. If you believe that, if this is who God truly is, if you magnify God like this, then it squeezes out Nineveh from that picture. And it makes Nineveh smaller. So you must think, therefore, of Nineveh as not nearly as significant as you'd thought before. But then verse 11 seems to address Nineveh directly. From you has come forth someone scheming evil against the Lord, someone advising villainy. This is a somewhat difficult one to translate. A wicked counselor, worthless counselor. It's Belial, which you know from other parts of the Bible where it's not translated, but used a significant word for indicating worthlessness, but also becoming a proper noun. Lemma, 26 times. Too many to look at. Back to Nahum 1. So it's a worthless counselor, but I think that word Belial here is not so much qualifying the counselor, but what the counselor is counseling. So that's why I translate someone advising something worthless and wicked. If you put these two truths together, I think it's like Nahum setting us up. This is who God is. He will not tolerate evil forever. And this is what you are, Nineveh. From you comes forth someone scheming evil against the Lord. What's going to happen? You've got someone who doesn't tolerate Yahweh, who doesn't tolerate his enemies, and you've got someone who schemes evil against the Lord. What's going to happen? Put 1 and 2 together, 1 and 1 together, you get 2. You get chapter 2. You see what's happening. The destruction of Nineveh has to happen at some point because they are plotting against the Lord. Here it's the different preposition used that's more specifically plotting. ESV treats them as interchangeably, translates in verse 9 and 11, plotting against evil, while I'm inclined to think that the poet is playing with different nuances of the word, and that's signaled by different prepositions. So 9 is about what do you think about God, and who is plotting against the Lord in verse 11. Thus the Lord said, we've got a citation formula. Go back there to get to the next page on my Hebrew. Even though they are completely at ease, and likewise many, so they look very impressive, they are shorn and he's gone. And what's more, though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. So now I will break his staff from upon you, so his rule over you, and your shackles, you being in prison, I will tear away. Beautiful, I've tried to reflect that in the poetry. You've got the staff and the shackles in the middle, and the verb breaking and tearing at the outer end, as if you've got this, again, imaged what's going on in the way of the phrase. And see why I think he's such a clever poet here, in the way he even arranges the sentences. That movement of taking those breaks apart is reflected even in the very way the poetic lines are put together. And the Lord has given a command concerning you, no more shall be sown from your name, so you won't have descendants to carry on your name. From the house of your gods, I will utterly cut off idol and image. I will prepare your grave because you are lightweight. So here's really part of that motive. You think there are many and completely at ease. Actually, they are lightweight. And I will make such a complete end of them, there won't even be anyone to bury the grave for them, so I have to do it myself. I will prepare your grave because you are lightweight. Nahum is often seen as kind of very patriotic, nationalistic, against Assyria, and it's all good for Judah. But actually, he speaks, I have afflicted you. That acknowledges that what happened there with the suffering of Judah wasn't an accident, or wasn't something that's entirely, for which you can entirely blame Assyria. I have afflicted you. Judah has been under God's punishment. So there are allusions just here and there that Nahum is not naive about Judah herself being less than pure. Then we come to that famous verse, look on the mountains, the feet of a herald who brings news of peace. So a significant aspect of a herald are the feet, because the herald is the one who runs with the message. People in the ancient world didn't run as much as Ethiopians do, but they run when there's a message to bring. And so when you see a single person running on the mountains, you know it's a messenger. If you see lots of people running, you know, oh, we've lost the war, everyone is running away. But if you see just one, you know, oh, it's a messenger coming. So look at those feet, that's great. He's going to bring good news. And the good news lead then to celebrate, Judah, your festivals, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the villain pass through you, using that same word, Belial. He's completely cut off. By now, is basically everything has been said. Nahum's message is all there in chapter 1. What he says about God, how this applies to Nineveh. If they are plotting against God, they're going to face his wrath at some point. And then finally, what it means for Judah, that they will be liberated and celebrate. So why do we have that many more poems to come? Which in many ways will not bring any new information. We've got it all there in chapter 1. That is because it is so important that truth-telling engages the emotions. And we've observed that a number of times. The use of poetry and metaphors is to drive down things. Our responsibility, also the responsibility of prophets, was never simply to explain, to teach, but to engage the emotions. Jonathan Edwards knew that in his book, The Religious Affections. He said, our affections are really very important. And so Nahum uses now a lot of imagery that engages the emotions. He uses wordplay, speaking about devastation, desolation, destruction, and then humiliation, and 4 images.